Hey everybody, welcome to the last of our online lectures. Today I'll be discussing Reconstruction, the Second Civil War. So after Tuesday's lecture in which we will discuss the Civil War in class, go ahead and watch this listen to this lecture before you watch the film Reconstruction, the Second Civil War. Both of them are available online. They're on Canvas. Part 1 is Revolution, Part 2 is Retreat, and check out the questions that are included in paper for handout. So the big question, now that the Civil War is over and that slaves are free and slavery has ended in the United States, what did freedom mean for ex-slaves or for ex-slave owners? Well, one thing it meant is that Civil War veterans, black veterans in South Carolina, they wanted to memorialize the dead. They buried Union soldiers at the racetrack in Charleston, South Carolina, thereby commemorating one of the first Memorial Days to honor the fallen veterans. And today we still celebrate Memorial Day in this fashion. So the first one was done by black veterans in South Carolina. You'll read David Blight's article about this. What did freedom mean for ex-slave owners? Well, it meant devastation, depression. Just think 2/3 of your wealth you've invested in buying these people. Now 2/3 of all your wealth is just gone, walked away. Now they are free. You no longer own these people. What else did it mean? In the South, 80% of white males served in the war. In the North, 50% of all able-bodied and of-aged males served. It's just huge numbers. Can you imagine 80 and 50%? It's just incredible. What did freedom mean for some generals? Well, this guy's an outlier. Confederate General James Longstreet. He was second in command under Lee of the Virginia Army of the North, Army of the Northern Virginia. I'm sorry. And after the war, he said, hey, we lost. It's time to move on. He did support freedom for free African Americans after the Civil War. Interestingly, and not surprisingly, there's no monuments to General Longstreet in the South because he did advocate civil rights after the war. In 1998, we did erect a statue in honor of Longstreet in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in the North. No monuments still to this day to Longstreet in the South. No elementary schools named after him because he supported black rights after the Civil War. This guy, on the other hand, Lieutenant General of the Confederate Army, Nathan Bedford Forrest, there are monuments to him everywhere in the South. There's literally elementary schools named after him. After the Civil War, he was one of the founding fathers of the KKK. He was the first Grand Dragon of the KKK. Created to put blacks, what he thought put blacks back in their place through violence and intimidation. For example, here's a statue of him heroically on a horse in Memphis, Tennessee. How did Americans cope with this massive loss? Sometimes whole towns would lost all their male population. Right? How did we deal with this? The country had never experienced like this. In fact, the world had never experienced a war of this magnitude. This was the most devastating war until World War I came around. Remember, all this industrial might just being pointed at each other with very accurate bullets, and we'll talk all about that in the Civil War lecture. Well, one way we dealt with the massive loss was the United States took away, appropriated General Robert E. Lee's slave plantation, and turned it into Arlington National Cemetery, turned it into a place where we honor and commemorate and bury our war dead. Okay, so Arlington National Cemetery. I highly encourage you, if you're in the D.C. area ever, take a tour of Arlington National Cemetery. Robert E. Lee's former plantation. How else did we deal with such devastating loss? Well, spiritualism, this thing in which we can commune with the dead, those who have not yet gone to heaven. There was this idea around about, at the time, that what happens to the souls of dead folks? the body actually lose a physical? Does the soul have a physical presence? There were people weighing bodies before and after death, seeing if actually there was less weight. Did the soul actually have a physical weight? Is it gone now? And this manifested itself in what we call spiritualism, in which folks were hired, seen as spiritualists, to actually commune and talk to the dead. This is Ouija. This is the invention of Ouija boards. You guys might have heard of them. The Ouija boards, you put your fingers on them, and some other force is supposed to move your fingers and communicate with you. There was a big boom of this talking to the dead and spiritualism after the Civil War. Not surprisingly, because we're just trying to cope with such massive loss. For example, Mary Todd Lincoln, the First Lady, she lost a number of family members in the war. Most of her family members, the men in her family, fought on the South, right? While she was the first lady executing the war from the North, her husband was. So this is an example of how the Civil War literally tore families apart. After World War II in Europe was a boom in spiritualism, right? People using Ouija boards, talking to the dead, trying to just deal with such massive loss. What did freedom mean for former enslaved people? Well, it meant a lot of things. One of the first things former enslaved people did was try to find your family. Remember, families were broken up, sold off, families were separated, and finding family, hey, we're trying to find your kin. And when that didn't work, people just made new kin. Adoptions, right? Just making new families out of the terror and the dislocation of slavery. The second biggest thing people wanted to do was learn to read, right? Find a school. They wanted to learn to read. They wanted to become Americans. They wanted to read the Declaration of Independence, the Bible, the Constitution. Many folks said, yeah, slavery took away my right to read, so they wanted to. They also wanted to run their own church. They didn't want to have some slave master preaching his version, preaching of the Bible what he chose. So they wanted to run their own church. Oftentimes school and church were in the same place. What did freedom, well, how is the federal government going to change the South? How do you reconstruct a system that was in place from the 1600s overnight after a 4-year devastating war? How do we transition from slave to free? This is something the movie is going to talk about in detail. Well, what the federal government did for the first time, the federal government's going to have a national presence with this Freedmen's Bureau. So most of these Freedmen's Bureau diplomats were former Union officers, former Union soldiers, and they're going down into the South and trying to mitigate between the whites and the blacks in the South. How are the whites going to work out paying the now free blacks, right? And talk about a very challenging job. Okay, the Freedmen's Bureau is going to try to do this. You're going to meet Marshall Twitchell in the film. He was a Freedmen's Bureau employee. As part of the federal government's Freedmen's Bureau, which tried to reconstruct the South in a more desegregated way, try to get rid of the apartheid in the South, is the first public schools were established in the South for whites and blacks. There were no public schools in the South before the 1860s. About 10,000 teachers, 4,000 schools, educated, again, white and black Southerners. And black literacy rose during the 10-year experiment that was the Reconstruction. Black literacy rose from about 5 to 20%, and that is quite astounding when you think about it. Black churches, again, as I mentioned a bit ago, black African Americans wanted to elect their own preacher. They didn't want to have the master choosing the preacher for them. They wanted to emphasize parts of the Bible which spoke to them. For example, during slavery, white preachers in the South would often emphasize the Bible's many sections about obeying your master. Right, obeying your master. Now, after the Civil War, black preachers are reading the Bible and choosing their own sections that speak to them. For example, Exodus, right? Moses leading the slaves out of Egypt, leading former enslaved people out of Egypt. They emphasize Matthew and Jesus' radical messages, right, of social and spiritual equality. So black churches are on the boom. What did freedom mean on the land? Well, literally, this is the Barrow Plantation in Georgia, right, 1860, and then 20 years later. Look at on the left-hand side during slavery. There's the engine house, that's the gin house. The master's house right next to all the tightly, right, compact slave quarters. And they're compact for control. It's a lot easier to control your property, who are constantly trying to rebel and run away if they are close together. Look what happens after slavery. The master's house now becomes the landlord's house, right? You cut a check to your landlord. You don't cut a check to your master, right? It's even in our vocabulary. And now on the right-hand side, you see the church and the school, something brand new in the South. And all the individual former slaves now have their own house. Granny's got a house right on the road. I like at the bottom. Breckton Barrow and Lem Douglas, they don't want any part of anybody. They're way out in the back 40. You have Joe Bugg and Jim Reed and Nancy Pope and Kane Pope and everybody else, right? Just kind of spread out. There is literally a change in the land. What did freedom mean legalistically? Well, the most important, after the after the 10 Bill of Rights, the things that really did redefine what it meant to be American were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. If you guys watch the film Lincoln by Steven Spielberg, it's about the 13th Amendment. So this is what the 13th Amendment says. It ends slavery. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the U.S. In other words, slavery's over unless you are convicted of a crime. And this is going to get sticky situations later on, which I'll discuss. And Section 2 is even equally important. So there's not going to be slavery, and if the federal government finds that there is slavery being practiced somewhere, the Congress has the power to enforce this article. In other words, the federal government has the right to send in the army if states are misbehaving. Section 2 is the enforcement clause, very important. The 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the U.S. Okay, so now everybody born here are citizens, right? And no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay? So, this is giving African Americans, it's aimed at African Americans, citizenship. Today we are debating this in the light of immigration, the debates over immigration. Okay, if you join me for my History 35 class in the spring, we will talk about this quite a bit. And the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. Okay? The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged, and the Congress can enforce it. Okay? Who were African Americans going to vote for when they do finally get the right to vote? Remember, after 300 years, no rights. Well, they're going to vote for Republicans, because that's the party of Lincoln, and they're going to vote for black Republicans, right? And it does become, as you'll see in the film, there's a few former slaves get elected in an office and go to Washington to sit in Congress. Talk about a revolution. That is truly a revolution. How did many whites in the South react to black empowerment after the Civil War ended and the earning of freedom and civil rights? Well, many whites supported the Ku Klux Klan, the Knights of the White Chameleon. Many sort of white supremacist terrorist organizations popped up throughout the South. And their first target were white and black Republicans, black churches, black schools, and anybody seen as sympathetic to African American civil rights. Yeah, terrifying, and they were terrifying on purpose. And they define themselves and liken themselves to Christian crusaders. You'll get more of this in the film. However, I want to end by talking about what freedom meant to this guy, Jordan Anderson. I think it sums up quite a bit. And this is in your reading, so you can read it at your pleasure, but I just want to make sure you get a little taste of how Jordan Anderson understood his place, understood what his new life would be after the Civil War. So this is his master writing him a letter, asking Jordan Anderson to come back to his plantation in Tennessee because he needs his help and his work. And this is Jordan Anderson responding to his former master. I got your letter and was glad to find you had not forgotten Jordan, and that you wanted me to come back and live with you again, promising to do better for me than anyone else can. I have often felt uneasy about you. I thought the Yankees would have hung you long before this for harboring Rebs they found at your house. I suppose they never heard about your going to Colonel Martin to kill the Union soldier that was left by his company in their stable. Although you shot at me twice before I left you, I did not want to hear of your being hurt, and am glad you are still living. It would do me good to go back to the dear old home again and see Miss Mary and Miss Martha and Alan, Esther, Green, and Lee. Give my love to them all, and tell them I hope we will meet in the better world, if not in this. I would have gone back to see you all when I was working in the Nashville hospital, but one of the neighbors told me Henry was the manager of the plantation. One of the neighbors told me Henry intended to shoot me if he ever got a chance. I want to know particularly what the good chances you propose to give me. I am doing tolerably well here. I get $25 a month with victuals and clothing, have comfortable home for Mandy, folks here call her Mrs. Anderson, and the children, Millie, Jane, and Grundy, go to school and are learning well. The teacher says Grundy has a head for a preacher. They go to Sunday school, and Mandy and me attend church regularly. We are kindly treated down in Tennessee. Sometimes we overhear others saying the colored people were slaves down in Tennessee. The children feel hurt when they hear such remarks, but I tell them it was no disgrace to belong to Colonel Anderson. Many darkies would have been proud, as I used to was, to call you master. Now if you will write and say what wages you will give me, I will be better able to decide whether it would be to my advantage to move back again. Stick with me. This is good. As to my freedom, which you say I can have, there is nothing to be gained on that score, as I got my free papers in 1864 from the Provost Marshal General of the Department of Nashville. Mandy says she would be afraid to go back without some proof that you are sincerely disposed to treat us justly and kindly. And we have concluded to test your sincerity, get this, by asking you to send us the wages for the time we served you. This will make us forget and forgive old scores and rely on your justice and friendship in the future. I served you faithfully for 32 years, and Mandy 20 years. At $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy, our earnings would amount to $11,680. Add to this the interest for the time our wages has been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing and 3 doctor's visits to me, and pulling a tooth for Mandy, and the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to. Please send the money by Adams Express in care of V. Winters, Dayton, Ohio. If you fail to pay us for faithful labors in the past, we can have little faith in your promise in the future. We trust the good Maker has opened your eyes to the wrongs which you and your fathers have done to me and my fathers. He's getting all historical now. In making us toil for you for generations without recompense, right? Without getting paid. Here I draw my wages every Saturday, but in Tennessee there was never any payday for the Negroes, any more than for the horses and cows. Surely there will be a day of reckoning for those who defraud laborer of his hire. Look at this last part here. Now he's getting to the violence of slavery. Quote, in answering this letter, please state if there would be any safety for my Millie and Jane, who are now grown up and both good-looking girls. You know how it was with Matilda and Catherine. I would rather stay here and starve and die if it comes to that than to have my girls brought to shame by the violence and wickedness of their young masters. You will also You will also please state if there has been any schools open for the colored children in your neighborhood. The great desire of my life now is to give my children an education and have them form virtuous habits. So he's saying, I don't want my children to get raped by, I don't want my children to get raped by masters, and I want my children to get an education. Jordan Anderson, this is what freedom means to him. P.S. Say howdy to George Carter and thank him for taking the pistol from you when you were shooting at me. From your old servant, Jordan Anderson. Boom. Drop the mic, Jordan. Walk off stage. Your work here is done. This letter from Jordan Anderson is quite amazing, and the fact that us historians have it, the only reason why we have it is that the the owner, the Colonel Anderson, sent it into the federal government so he could get money for the slave that got away. He was trying to get compensation for the slaves that he lost. He didn't get it, but that's the only reason why this has lasted. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this introduction to Reconstruction, the Second Civil War. Now go ahead and turn your attention to watching the film. I think it's a really powerful film. The historians that are interviewed in the film are the top-notch, great historians in the field. The black historian, you're going to see Clarence Walker, fantastic guy, worked with him at UC Davis. If you guys are going to go to UC Davis, please take a class from Clarence Walker. He's a fantastic historian, fantastic person. Okay, that's it for today. Bye-bye.